The small town hall was already full long before the event officially started. People filled every seat, while others stood along the walls, chatting softly and waiting for the competition to begin. It was one of those rare evenings when the whole community came together, dressed a little nicer than usual, carrying excitement in their voices. The annual music event was always a big deal here. It wasn't just about winning. It was about pride, recognition, and sometimes even changing a life. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different. The air felt heavy, filled with nervous energy. Contestants moved around, checking their instruments, practicing quietly, or simply sitting still with their eyes closed, trying to calm their thoughts. Some had come from nearby cities, wearing polished outfits and carrying expensive instruments in shiny cases. They looked confident, like they belonged there. Near the corner of the backstage room, away from most of the crowd, stood a young woman. She held onto an old instrument case with both hands, as if it meant everything to her. Her clothes were simple, neat, but clearly not new. Her shoes had small signs of wear, and her hair was tied back in a plain style. There was nothing about her appearance that drew attention. Her name was Aisha. She quietly looked around the room, noticing how everyone seemed so sure of themselves. Some contestants laughed together, sharing stories of past performances. Others spoke about music schools, teachers, and experiences on big stages. Aisha didn't join any of those conversations. She didn't feel like she belonged in them. Instead, she moved slowly toward an empty chair and sat down. She placed the instrument case on her lap and rested her hands on top of it. Her fingers tapped gently, not out of impatience, but as if she was remembering something. A rhythm, a feeling. A few contestants nearby glanced at her, then at each other. Their expressions carried quiet judgment. One of them leaned closer to another and whispered something. They both smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made someone feel small without saying a single word out loud. Aisha noticed. Of course she did. It wasn't the first time. She lowered her gaze and took a slow breath. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago how to stay calm on the outside, even when everything inside felt uncertain. On the other side of the room, one of the event organizers walked in holding a clipboard. He began calling out names, checking attendance. His voice was loud enough to fill the room, but not warm enough to comfort anyone. As names were called, contestants stepped forward confidently, some even adding a quick smile or greeting. When he finally called Aisha's name, there was a slight pause before she stood up. "Aisha?" he repeated, looking around. "I'm here," she said softly, raising her hand. The man looked at her for a moment, then quickly checked her name off the list. There was a brief hesitation in his expression, as if he wasn't sure what to expect from her. Then he moved on without saying anything else. Aisha sat back down, her grip on the case tightening just a little. Time passed slowly. The sound of the audience outside grew louder as more people arrived. The faint echo of microphones being tested reached backstage. Every small sound reminded the contestants that the moment was getting closer. Aisha leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a second. Memories began to surface. Long hours of practice, quiet nights, and moments when she almost gave up. There had been times when it felt pointless, when no one believed in her, when even she doubted herself. But something always pulled her back. She opened her eyes again and looked down at the case. Carefully, she unlatched it just enough to peek inside. The instrument rested there, old but well cared for. It didn't look impressive, but it held years of effort, patience, and quiet determination. She gently closed the case again, as if protecting something fragile. Across the room, two contestants were talking louder now, not bothering to hide their opinions. "Some people just come for fun, I guess," one of them said, glancing briefly in Aisha's direction. "Yeah," the other replied with a small laugh. "You can tell who's serious and who isn't." Aisha heard every word. Her chest tightened for a moment, but she didn't react. She had heard worse before. Instead, she straightened her back and adjusted her grip on the case. Her face remained calm, but there was something deeper in her eyes now. something steady, something unshaken. A volunteer entered the room and announced that the competition would begin in 10 minutes. The energy shifted instantly. Conversations faded. Movements became quicker, sharper. Everyone started preparing in their own way. Aisha stood up slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply stood there, taking in the moment. This was it. For a brief second, doubt tried to creep in again. What if they were right? What if she didn't belong here? What if all those quiet hours meant nothing? But just as quickly, another thought replaced it. What if they were wrong? She took a deep breath and held it for a moment before letting it out slowly. Her hands stopped trembling. Her shoulders relaxed. One by one, contestants were called to line up near the stage entrance. The sound of the audience clapping for the opening announcement echoed through the hall. It was loud, almost overwhelming. Aisha joined the line, standing near the end. From where she stood, she could see a small part of the stage through the curtain. Bright lights shone down, making everything look larger, more important. The first contestant was called. A confident figure walked out, greeted by applause. The curtain shifted slightly, then closed again. The line moved forward. Aisha stepped closer to the stage entrance. Her heartbeat grew louder in her ears, but her face remained calm. She could feel the energy from the audience now, even without seeing them fully. Another contestant was called. More applause. More movement. Aisha looked down at her hands. They were steady now. Someone standing behind her whispered, "Good luck." She turned slightly, surprised. It was a quiet voice, sincere, without judgment. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small, genuine smile. It was a small moment, but it mattered. The line moved again. Now she stood just a few steps away from the curtain. The sounds from the stage became clearer. The music, the applause, the occasional cheer. Each performance was being heard, judged, remembered. Aisha adjusted her grip on the case one last time. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to focus. This wasn't about proving others wrong. This was about showing who she truly was. The curtain shifted again as another contestant finished. Applause filled the hall. A voice called out the next name. Aisha opened her eyes. Her turn was coming. And in that quiet space between doubt and courage, she stood ready. The curtain moved slightly as another contestant stepped off the stage. The sound of applause followed, loud and full of energy. Aisha stood still, just a few steps away from the entrance, holding her instrument case close to her side. The bright lights from the stage spilled through the small gap in the curtain, creating a sharp contrast with the dim backstage area. Her name had not been called yet, but she could feel it getting closer. Each passing second felt heavier, like time was stretching just for her. In front of her, two contestants were quietly talking. One of them adjusted their outfit while the other checked their reflection on a phone screen. Their movements were confident, practiced, almost effortless. "Did you hear the last performance?" One of them whispered. "Yeah," the other replied. "Pretty good, but not strong enough to win." They spoke like judges, not participants. Then one of them glanced back, their eyes briefly landing on Aisha. There was a pause, just a second, but it was enough to carry meaning. "She's after me, right?" the first one asked. "I think so," the other said, lowering their voice slightly. "Should be interesting." They both exchanged a small smile, the kind that didn't feel welcoming. Aisha looked away. She didn't want to focus on them. Still, their words lingered in her mind, repeating softly, "Interesting." She shifted her weight slightly and took a slow breath. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the case, then relaxed again. She reminded herself why she was here. Not for them. Not for their opinions. A volunteer walked past, holding a list and speaking into a small headset. "Next 3 contestants, be ready," they said quickly before moving on. The line moved forward again. Now Aisha was second. Her heart began to beat faster, but her face stayed calm. She had learned how to carry nerves quietly, without letting them show. The contestant in front of her rolled their shoulders and took a deep breath. When their name was called, they walked onto the stage with confidence. greeted by applause. The curtain fell back into place. Aisha was now first in line. The sounds from the stage became clearer. She could hear the music start. Smooth, controlled, confident. The audience responded warmly, clapping along at certain moments. Aisha stood there listening. Each note from the stage felt like a reminder of the expectations waiting on the other side of the curtain. These weren't casual listeners. These were people who knew what they liked, people who could tell the difference between average and exceptional. For a brief moment, doubt returned. What if she made a mistake? What if her hands slipped? What if the sound didn't come out the way she imagined? Her thoughts began to race, one after another, building pressure inside her chest. But then something shifted. She remembered the quiet nights when no one was watching, the long hours spent practicing, repeating the same part again and again until it felt right. The moments when she played not for an audience but for herself. Those moments were real. Those moments mattered. The sound from the stage reached its peak, followed by strong applause. The performance ended. The curtain moved again. The contestant walked back in, smiling, clearly satisfied. A few people congratulated them quietly as they passed. Aisha stepped forward. The volunteer looked at her and checked the list. "Get ready," they said. She nodded. The seconds felt slower now, heavier. The noise from the audience faded into a distant hum. Everything around her seemed quieter, as if the world was giving her space for this moment. From the side of the stage, one of the judges leaned slightly toward another and said something. Their voices were low, but their expressions showed focus. They were paying attention. Every performance mattered to them. Aisha noticed this and felt a small wave of pressure, but also something else. Opportunity. Backstage, a few contestants watched her now. Some with curiosity, others with the same quiet doubt as before. No one said anything directly, but their eyes spoke enough. One of them crossed their arms, leaning against the wall. "This should be quick," they muttered under their breath. Another gave a soft chuckle. Aisha heard it. This time she didn't look away. She lifted her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. Not angry, not upset, just steady. The volunteer signaled toward the stage. "It's your turn." For a brief second, everything paused. Aisha adjusted her grip on the instrument case, then stepped forward. Each step toward the curtain felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. The light grew brighter as she got closer. The sounds of the audience became clearer again. Whispers, small movements, the soft shuffle of people settling in their seats. She reached the curtain. There was a short pause. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall, clear and formal as they spoke her name. The audience responded with polite applause. Not too loud, not too quiet. It was the kind of applause given out of respect, not expectation. Aisha took one final breath. Then she stepped onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she imagined. For a moment they made it hard to see clearly. The audience appeared as a blur of faces, rows and rows stretching across the hall. She walked to the center of the stage, each step careful and steady. The applause faded. Silence began to settle in. From the judges' table, a few eyes studied her closely. One of them adjusted their glasses, another leaned forward slightly, observing. There was no excitement in their expressions yet, just curiosity, maybe even doubt. Aisha placed her instrument case gently on the floor. For a brief second, her hands rested on it. The entire hall felt still. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat. Then silence returned again, deeper this time. Backstage, a few contestants stood near the curtain, watching quietly. Their earlier confidence had softened into curiosity. Aisha slowly opened the case. The small sound of the latch clicking echoed more than expected in the quiet hall. She lifted the instrument carefully, holding it with familiarity and care. It wasn't new. It didn't shine under the stage lights like others had. But there was something about the way she held it. Something natural, something practiced. She adjusted her position. The judges watched more closely now. The audience leaned in just a little. Aisha raised her hands into place. Her fingers hovered for a brief moment. The silence grew heavier. It felt like the entire room was waiting, not with excitement, but with uncertainty. And in that quiet moment, all the whispers, all the doubts, all the quiet judgments seemed to gather in one place. Waiting, watching, expecting very little. Aisha closed her eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to focus. When she opened them again, something had changed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. The noise in her mind was gone. Now there was only one thing left. The music. And just before the first note, in that fragile space between expectation and reality, the entire room held its breath. For a brief moment, everything stood still. Aisha's fingers rested lightly on the instrument, her posture calm, her face quiet. The silence in the hall felt deep, almost heavy, as if every person in the room was waiting for something, but not really expecting much. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Someone near the back whispered something and then quickly stopped. The judges sat still, watching, their expressions neutral. Then it happened. The first note. It was soft, almost gentle but clear. Not shaky, not uncertain. Clear. It moved through the hall slowly, like a ripple across still water. The sound was simple, but there was something in it. Something that made people pause without even realizing why. Aisha didn't rush. She let that first note settle before moving to the next. Then another. And another. The melody began to form, steady and controlled. Her fingers moved with ease, not forced, not tense. It was as if the instrument wasn't something separate from her. It was part of her. In the front row, one of the judges slightly raised their eyebrows. It was a small reaction, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The audience grew quieter. The soft whispers faded. The music continued. At first, people were simply listening out of politeness. But slowly that changed. Heads lifted. Eyes focused. The sound coming from the stage was not what they had expected. It wasn't basic. It wasn't weak. Carried feeling. Aisha's expression remained calm. But inside, something had shifted. The nervousness that had been sitting quietly within her was gone now. In its place was something stronger. Confidence. Not loud or proud, but steady and grounded. Her fingers began to move more freely. The melody grew richer. Each note connected smoothly to the next, creating something that felt complete, something that told a story without words. In the audience, a man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it. A woman sitting beside him leaned forward slightly, her attention now fully on the stage. Backstage, the contestants who had been whispering earlier stood closer to the curtain now. Their expressions had changed. There was no more smiling, no more quiet jokes. Now there was silence and surprise. On stage, Aisha shifted into a slightly faster section. Her hands moved with more energy, but still with control. There was no hesitation, no struggle. Every movement felt natural. The sound filled the hall, growing stronger, deeper. The judges exchanged quick glances. One of them leaned back slightly, crossing their arms, not in doubt, but in thought. This was not what they had expected. Not at all. Aisha's focus remained unbroken. Her eyes were open now, looking ahead, but not really seeing the audience. She wasn't playing for their approval anymore. She was playing from memory, from feeling, from somewhere deeper than fear. The music shifted again. This time it slowed down, becoming softer, more emotional. The change was smooth, almost effortless. It pulled the audience in closer than before. You could feel it in the room. People weren't just hearing the music now. They were feeling it. A child in the audience, who had been restless earlier, sat still, watching quietly. An older man closed his eyes for a moment, listening carefully, as if the sound was bringing back something from long ago. Aisha's fingers moved gently, almost like they were telling a story no one else could see. There was no sign of nervousness anymore, no sign of doubt, only control, only presence. Backstage, one of the contestants whispered, "That's not normal." Another nodded slowly, unable to look away. The earlier judgment had disappeared, replaced by something else. Respect. On stage, the music began to build again. Stronger now, more powerful. Aisha's hands moved faster, but still precise. Not a single movement looked rushed or careless. It was clear she knew exactly what she was doing. The audience sat completely still. No whispers, no movement, just listening. One of the judges leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table, their eyes fixed on her hands. Another judge gave a slight nod, almost to themselves. The performance had gone from unexpected to undeniable. Aisha reached a complex part of the piece, the kind of section where mistakes often happen, where even skilled performers sometimes struggle. But she didn't. Her fingers moved with confidence, hitting every note cleanly, smoothly. There was no tension in her shoulders, no hesitation in her hands. It was effortless, and that was what made it powerful. The room felt different now. The same people who had doubted her just minutes ago were now fully silent, fully focused. Even those who had whispered earlier backstage were now watching with wide eyes. The energy had shifted completely. Aisha didn't notice any of it. Or maybe she did, but it didn't matter anymore. She was lost in the music now. The final section approached. The part where everything comes together. The melody grew stronger, fuller, filling every corner of the hall. Carried emotion, strength, and something deeper, something real. Her hands moved with certainty, her posture steady, her breathing calm. And then, the final notes. She didn't rush them. She let them flow, one after another, each one placed carefully, like the closing lines of a story. The last note lingered in the air, soft, clear, complete. And then, silence. Not the kind from before. This silence was different. It wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with something else. Shock. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room needed a second to understand what they had just heard. Aisha slowly lowered her hands. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes now. She stood still, waiting, not expecting anything, not demanding anything, just standing there. The silence stretched for one more second, then another, and in that moment, everything that people thought they knew about her had already changed. For a moment, the silence stayed exactly as it was. Aisha stood still at the center of the stage, her hands now resting gently at her sides. The last note of her performance had already faded, but the feeling it left behind was still hanging in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes when people don't know how to react yet. In the front row, one of the judges slowly leaned back in their chair, their eyes still fixed on Aisha. Another judge looked down briefly, as if trying to gather their thoughts, then looked up again. Backstage, the contestants who had been watching stood completely still. The earlier whispers were gone. No one smiled now. No one joked. They were all trying to process what they had just seen. Aisha took a slow breath. She didn't rush to leave the stage. She didn't try to read the audience. She simply stood there, calm, steady, waiting. Then it happened. A single clap. It came from somewhere in the middle of the audience. Sharp, clear. It broke the silence. Then another clap followed. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. Not polite applause, not forced, real applause. People began clapping louder, stronger. Some leaned forward, others straightened in their seats. The energy in the room changed completely, rising fast, like a wave building strength. Aisha blinked once, slightly surprised, but she didn't show too much emotion. She simply gave a small nod of respect. The applause didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. A few people in the audience stood up. Then more followed. Within moments, a large part of the hall was on their feet. A standing ovation. Backstage, the contestants looked at each other, their expressions now filled with disbelief. One of them quietly said, "That doesn't happen easily here." Another nodded, still staring toward the stage. The judges began clapping as well, though their reactions were more controlled. Still, there was no doubt in their expressions anymore. The doubt was gone. Aisha slowly picked up her instrument and placed it back into its case with care. Even in that moment, she didn't rush. Her movements remained calm, respectful, grounded. The applause continued. As she closed the case, she finally allowed herself to look out at the audience more clearly. This time, she saw them, not as a blur, but as people. People who were now looking at her differently. The same faces that had shown uncertainty earlier were now filled with admiration, surprise, and something close to respect. She held that moment quietly. Then, with a small, sincere gesture, she gave a slight bow. The applause grew even louder. Somewhere near the front, an older woman wiped her eyes gently. A man beside her nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something unspoken. On stage, Aisha turned carefully and began walking back toward the curtain. Each step felt lighter now, not because the pressure was gone, but because something had changed inside her. She had done what she came to do, and more. As she reached the curtain, the light softened again. The noise from the audience became slightly distant as she stepped backstage. The moment she crossed back behind the curtain, the atmosphere shifted again. But this time it wasn't filled with judgment. It was filled with silence of a different kind. The contestants who had once whispered stood there, unsure of what to say. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at her directly, but with a new kind of expression. Respect. Aisha walked past them quietly, holding her case. No one laughed now. No one whispered. One of the contestants who had spoken earlier took a small step forward, as if wanting to say something, but then stopped. The words didn't come. Another simply nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement. Aisha noticed, but she didn't react strongly. She just gave a small, polite nod in return and continued walking. Near the corner of the room, she placed her case down and sat on the same chair she had used before. The same place. But everything felt different now. Her hands rested on her lap, still calm. Her breathing steady. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to feel something deeper. Not pride. Not relief. Just quiet satisfaction. Across the room, the event organizer looked at her again. This time, there was no hesitation in his expression. Only recognition. He checked his clipboard, then looked back up, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Strong performance, he said briefly as he passed by. It wasn't a long comment, but it was enough. Aisha gave a small nod. Thank you. The next contestant was called onto the stage. The competition continued. Music filled the hall again. But something had changed in the energy. Even the audience seemed more alert now, as if they had been reminded of what was possible. Backstage, the remaining contestants prepared for their turns, but the mood was different. There was less confidence now, more focus, more seriousness. Aisha sat quietly, listening to the performances that followed. Each one was good. Some were very good. But the room didn't react the same way it had for her. There were claps, appreciation, even smiles. But not that silence. Not that shift. Not that moment. Time passed. One performance after another. The event moved closer to its end. Aisha remained seated, calm and still, her eyes occasionally closing as she listened. She wasn't comparing. She wasn't judging. She was simply present. At one point, a contestant who had earlier doubted her walked closer and stood a few steps away. There was a pause. Then quietly they spoke. I didn't expect that. Aisha looked up. Their tone wasn't mocking anymore. It was honest. She gave a small smile. That's okay. The contestant nodded slowly, then stepped back. No more words were needed. The final performance of the night ended with applause. The announcer returned to the stage, thanking everyone for their participation. The judges began preparing their notes, speaking quietly among themselves. Backstage, the contestants gathered, some talking softly, others waiting in silence. Aisha remained where she was, still calm, still grounded. The results had not been announced yet, but something inside her already felt complete. Because no matter what happened next, she had already changed the room, and in doing so, she had changed how they saw her, forever. The hall slowly settled after the final performance. The energy that had filled the room throughout the evening was still there, but it had changed. Felt calmer now, more thoughtful. People were no longer just enjoying the event. They were reflecting on what they had seen and heard. On stage, the announcer stepped forward again, holding a small card in hand. The microphone gave a soft sound as it adjusted. The audience grew quiet, knowing what was coming next. Backstage, all the contestants had gathered closer now. Some stood with their arms crossed, others paced slowly, and a few simply stared toward the stage without moving. The results were about to be announced, and even the most confident ones felt the weight of the moment. Aisha stood near the side, her instrument case resting beside her. Her hands were relaxed, her shoulders steady. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't whispering. She was simply standing there, present in the moment. But inside, her thoughts were moving. Not fast, not anxious, just thoughtful. She replayed parts of her performance in her mind, the first note, the quiet middle, the final ending. She remembered the silence that followed, the applause, the way the room had changed. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing clearly. She had given her best. Near her, two contestants spoke in low voices. "I think it's between a few people," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. But after that performance, they didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need to. Across the room, someone else shook their head slightly, still processing everything. "I've never seen the judges react like that," they said quietly. The atmosphere was different now. No one was underestimating anyone anymore, especially not Aisha. On stage, the announcer smiled politely and began speaking. Words of appreciation filled the hall, thanks to the audience, the participants, and the judges. It was the usual speech, but tonight people listened more carefully. Backstage, no one spoke now. All attention was on the stage. The announcer paused briefly, then looked down at the card. "The judges have made their decision." A small wave of tension moved through the room. Aisha felt her heartbeat rise slightly, but her face remained calm. "The third place winner is..." A name was announced. Applause followed. One of the contestants backstage let out a breath and walked toward the stage, their face showing a mix of relief and pride. The audience clapped warmly as they accepted their position. Backstage, the others waited. The space felt tighter now, more focused. "The second place winner is..." Another pause. Another name. More applause. The second place contestant stepped forward, smiling, though there was a hint of disappointment behind their eyes. Still, they nodded respectfully as they accepted the result. Backstage, the remaining contestants stood very still. Only one position remained. First place. Aisha stood quietly, her hands loosely held together. For a brief second, doubt tried to return. What if it wasn't her? What if her performance, as powerful as it felt, wasn't enough? But just as quickly, she let that thought pass. Because this moment wasn't about fear anymore. It was about truth. On stage, the announcer took a slightly deeper breath before speaking again. "And now, the first place winner of tonight's competition is..." The pause felt longer this time. The entire hall seemed to lean into that silence. Aisha didn't move. Her eyes stayed focused, her breathing steady. Then, her name. It echoed clearly through the hall. For a moment, it didn't feel real. The sound of applause came almost instantly, loud and strong, filling every corner of the room. This time, it wasn't just appreciation. It was agreement. People nodded as they clapped. Some even smiled as if they had expected it. Backstage, the contestants reacted in different ways. A few clapped sincerely. Others stood quietly, accepting the result. The earlier doubts had completely disappeared now, because the result made sense. Aisha blinked once, then slowly looked toward the stage. Her name had been called. She had won. But even in that moment, she didn't rush. She picked up her instrument case, held it carefully, and began walking toward the stage. Each step felt steady, grounded. As she stepped into the light again, the applause grew louder. The same stage, the same lights, but everything felt different now. This time, she wasn't being watched with doubt. She was being welcomed with respect. She walked to the center of the stage, where the announcer stood smiling. "Congratulations," they said, handing her the award. Aisha accepted it with both hands, her expression calm but warm. "Thank you," she said softly. The judges stood up this time. They clapped as well. One of them gave a small nod of approval, another offered a brief smile. It wasn't exaggerated. It was genuine. The audience continued clapping, some even standing again, just like before. Aisha looked out at the crowd. This time, she allowed herself to take it in fully. The faces, the reactions, the energy. It wasn't overwhelming anymore. Felt real. For a brief second, her eyes softened. Not with emotion that needed to be shown loudly, but with something quiet and meaningful. Gratitude. She gave a small bow again. The applause continued. Backstage, the contestants watched her. But now, no one questioned her place, because she had earned it. Completely. On stage, the announcer gestured for a photo. Aisha stood still, holding the award, the lights shining around her. The moment was captured. But what mattered more was everything that had led to it. As the applause slowly began to fade, Aisha stepped back slightly, preparing to leave the stage once again. But this time, she wasn't the same person who had walked onto it earlier, because in just a few moments, she had gone from being doubted to being undeniable. The applause slowly faded as Aisha stepped away from the center of the stage. The bright lights no longer felt as intense, and the noise of the crowd softened into a warm background hum. She held the award carefully in one hand and her instrument case in the other, walking back toward the curtain with the same calm steps she had taken before. But inside, something had quietly changed. Not in a loud or overwhelming way, just a quiet understanding. As she crossed backstage again, the atmosphere felt completely different from earlier. The same room, the same people, but not the same energy. A few contestants stepped forward this time. "Congratulations," one of them said, their voice sincere. Aisha gave a small smile. "Thank you." Another nodded, adding, "You really deserved it." There was no hesitation in their tone. No hidden meaning. Just honesty. Aisha appreciated that more than anything. She placed her instrument case down near the chair where she had been sitting earlier. The award rested gently in her hands for a moment before she set it beside her. For a second, she simply looked at it. Not with excitement, not with disbelief, but with quiet reflection. This small object carried more than just a result. It carried every moment that had led her here. The long nights, the doubts, the practice, the silence, the effort no one had seen. And now it was real. Around her, people began to gather their things. Some contestants prepared to leave, others spoke with friends or family who had come to support them. The event was ending, but the feeling of the night was still present. One of the judges entered backstage, holding a few papers. They looked around briefly, then walked toward Aisha. She stood up as they approached. "You played with a lot of control," the judge said. "But more importantly, you played with feeling. That's not something everyone can do." Aisha listened quietly. "Keep going," the judge added. "Don't stop here." She nodded. "I won't." The judge gave a small approving look, then moved on. It was a simple conversation, but it stayed with her. After a few minutes, Aisha picked up her things and slowly walked toward the exit of the hall. The noise from the audience area had softened now, as people began leaving their seats and heading out. When she stepped outside, the air felt cooler, calmer. The night had settled in. Streetlights glowed softly, and small groups of people stood nearby, talking about the event. Some were still discussing performances, sharing opinions, reliving moments. A few people recognized her as she walked by. "That's her," someone whispered. "The winner." Aisha heard it, but she didn't stop. She simply continued walking, not because she didn't appreciate it, but because she didn't need to hold on to it. What mattered had already happened. She reached a quieter part of the street and paused for a moment. The noise of the hall was now distant, replaced by a peaceful stillness. She took a deep breath, the kind that feels different after something important. For a brief second, her mind went back to earlier that day. The way she had walked in, the looks, the whispers, the quiet judgment. It all felt so far away now, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer had power. She adjusted her grip on the instrument case and continued walking. Her steps were steady, not rushed, not slow, just right. As she moved through the quiet street, memories came and went. Small moments from her past, times when she had practiced alone, times when she had doubted herself, times when she almost stopped. But she hadn't stopped, and that made all the difference. A small smile appeared on her face, not because she had won, but because she had stayed consistent, stayed patient, stayed true to what she believed in. Further down the road, she passed by a small shop with a glass window. For a moment, she caught her reflection. She paused, looked at herself. The same simple clothes, the same calm expression. Nothing on the outside had changed, but she knew something on the inside had, and that was enough. She continued walking. The award in her hand felt lighter now, not because it had lost meaning, but because it no longer felt like something she had to prove. It was simply a result, not the reason. As she reached the end of the street, she slowed down slightly, taking in the quiet around her. No applause, no stage, no audience, just her. And in that silence, she felt something clear and steady. This was not the end. It was just a beginning. There would be more moments ahead, more rooms, more people, some who would doubt, some who would believe. But now, she knew something she hadn't fully understood before. She didn't need everyone to believe in her. She just needed to keep going. A light breeze passed through the street, soft and cool. Aisha adjusted her hold on the instrument case one last time and continued forward, her steps fading into the quiet night. Behind her, the hall still stood, filled with memories of the evening. Ahead of her, the path was open, and this time, she walked it with certainty.